Hello, my name is Jordan Johnson, and this is my Culminating project. For this project, I talked to people I know from all generations. I talked to my friend who's Gen Z, my sister, a millennial, my mom, who's Gen X. My dad is technically a boomer, but he says that he's Gen X, so he's kind of like in the middle, and my grandfather, who's a definite boomer. I asked them about the most impactful events from their generation, and most of their answers were things that we have talked about in the course. The biggest similarity between all of the generations I interviewed was the impact of technology and how fast it seemed to grow, and how big of an impact that had on just our lives, like our everyday lives. Even today, technology is growing at insane speeds. It seems like every day there's some new kind of tech coming out, and we seem like we can't even go a day without technology today. When I interviewed my granddad, he talked about how he took care of his younger siblings and started working at a young age to support his family. And he's talked about there was always like constant wars that were going on that seemed like a shadow looming over him, but he and everyone else around him tried to live life as normal as possible because, as he said, the world keeps on going. He talked to me about how even though his generation was faced with adversity and challenges, they pushed through and created a foundation for the rest of the generations to build on. In an article by PJ Rourke, the author talks about the same thing. They talked about how the boomers made the world better, even if they weren't perfect. To everyone else, the boomers are self-centered and have made it harder for the younger generations to live, but to them, they have made it so that later generations don't have to struggle and they have it easy. As my granddad says, my dad will be the first one to tell you that Gen X did in fact not have it easy. Gen X went through just as much as the boomers did and dealt with a shift in American society. Dad talked about how both of his parents worked, so it was just him and his brother, my uncle, most of the time. When I asked my dad what the most impactful thing during his generation, he told me it was TVs and the beginning of having more technology. He talked about how the TVs kind of felt like a parent to him because his parents weren't there half of the time, and that it felt like he had the world at his fingertips when technology started coming out. Surprisingly, my mom said the same thing. I would have expected her to talk about music. She was obsessed with Air Supply when I was younger. But surprisingly, she said the same thing about technology and how it has completely changed our lives and like changed the trajectory of how we live every day. One thing that was really interesting doing these interviews was how much technology was mentioned. Not only did my mom and dad mention technology, but my sister did too. She talked about how technology changed during her generation and how we have more power in our phones than we did in the rocket that went to the moon. My sister remembers the first phone she got, and she thought it was the coolest thing ever just because it wasn't a flip phone. It was one of those phones that like had the keyboards that slid out. Millennials were the last generation before the technology boom. They remember the growth of technology and how much it changed their lives and became the new normal. Another thing my mom and my sister both talked about is how dependent the newer generations have become to technology, especially with the invention of AI. It's like we don't even have to think for ourselves anymore. Any question we have can be answered without us having to put any effort. When I was talking to my younger cousin at Thanksgiving, she actually told me that she'll ask ChatGPT every question she has. I was very concerned. I agree that some people have become way too dependent on technology, and she seems to be one of those people. Finally, I interviewed my friend who is Gen Z. I asked her what the most impactful event of our generation has been, and she told me that it was COVID. She told me about how COVID completely changed our high school experience and the world in general. We were in 8th grade when the lockdown started, and she and I both agree that the lockdown changed us into completely different people. We were also born into a generation where it felt like there was constantly something going wrong in the world, similar to how my granddad was during his generation. The world seems like it is on fire, but we do our best to just live our lives normally. We had to deal with constant challenges from the COVID lockdown to the rise of social media. It felt like you had to act or look a certain way. Even though we were faced with adversity and a new era of technology, we took our experiences and have tried to use them to make our lives better in the future. In conclusion, I feel like each generation has faced its own challenges, and each generation is kind of bonded through those impactful events they faced growing up. Each generation has had to deal with wars, economic problems, and societal changes. The biggest similarity between all the generations was how much technology affected them and changed the way they lived their lives. From computers that took up a ton of room and didn't really do much to phones that are tiny and have 10 times the power as those computers. I think the biggest thing I took away from this project is how similar the generations are. Even though we face different challenges, those challenges changed the way we looked at the world and forced us all to be strong and be able to face and go past those challenges. And then here are my references. Yes.